Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 4th, and we will hear the rise of urban placemaking, shaping public spaces through collaboration. For technical questions related to today's session, you can type those in your questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. And for questions for our panelists today, again, just type those in that questions box in your tool panel, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2022. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today we are sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. So thanks to you all, as always, for bringing us great sessions here, and we appreciate you joining us. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our last two sessions for 2022. I just secured a law session today. Yay! It will be on December 8th, which I believe is a Tuesday. And so I will have information about that session. Obviously, it will be available for law credit. I'll have that info available soon up on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. We might have a third one as well, if I can squeeze it in through the, the craziness of the last 2 months of the year. So again, you can register for upcoming sessions by heading over to our website. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 AICP CM credits. To log your credits, just head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any important date or time changes, when new sessions are available for you to register for, and I send out weekly reminders of the webcast that's available every week. So be sure to like us there, and head over to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. We record all of our sessions and we post them up onto our YouTube channel. We have well over 400 recordings available for you. So you can subscribe to us and then you'll be notified when new sessions have been added to our channel. So again, if you have any questions, either technical questions or for today's panelists, you can just type those in your questions box, and we'll get to the Q&A for the panelist questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over verbally to you, Celeste, to give an introduction and to kick things off.
Thank you, Christine, and it's really nice to meet you, and so nice to meet all of you who are on the webinar. Thanks for joining and spending your Friday afternoon talking about urban placemaking. Hopefully, as for me, this is a fun topic for you, and it'll be a great time to spend together. So, my name is Celeste Frye. I am the CEO of a planning firm based in New York City called Public Works Partners. I am an AICP certified planner. I actually love to tell APA folks that I only got my AICP in 2021, which was almost 20 years to the day after I finished planning school. So if you've been wondering if you've been out of school too long to be able to take a giant exam, you can do it. I did it. It was actually a great pandemic activity, studying for the exam. So now I just have to figure out how to, get enough CM credits to keep my certification. I do, however, have about 20 years of experience in urban planning, but also in local government and in consulting. I did my planning degree at Cornell's School of City and Regional Planning, and I live in the New York City area. So Public Works Partners, my firm, is a mission-driven urban planning and management consulting firm. We work with communities large and small to inform planning and placemaking processes to advance critical issues and challenges in neighborhoods across the country. We're based in New York City, but we do our work in the city, regionally, and nationally. in all different types of communities. We're also a proud woman-owned business, also certified as a disadvantaged business and small business with different, government entities. Before I dive into my presentation, we have a quick poll for you. 2 questions. If Christine, if you could start the poll. Are you familiar with urban placemaking? Is that something you have, and is that something you have experience with in your work?
Okay,
Please
folks,
take
that is up on there now, that first one. So we'll go ahead and do that one. So again, you can just select yes, no, kind of, and we'll give it a few minutes, a few seconds here, and we'll go from there. Great. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and close that one down. I'm going to share the results. So yes, 70% of us on the line today are familiar with placemaking, and 21% kind of, and then 9% no. So I will hide those results. And Celeste, do you want to go into the second question?
Sure. So do you have experience practicing placemaking in your work? And that I would assume that is mostly folks who are familiar with placemaking from the first question. Do we have a poll for that question?
We don't. I don't have that question. I was not given that one. So if you all just want to like text or put some text into the questions box, and then I can just, if you're familiar or if you have experience practicing in your work, just a yes or no right in the questions box. If you want to do that real quick, I can kind of take a stab at a percentage of folks that are.
Great. Thank you, Christine. And what we can do while people are doing that, we can go on to the next slide, which is our agenda for our time together today. And this presentation is divided into 4 sections. In the first section, I will discuss the history of placemaking and what the practice means to us at Public Works and to the field. In section 2, we will dig into the tools that are needed, excuse me, for placemaking and really how it is different from other types of urban planning and urban design. In section 3, we will go through a couple of case studies of urban placemaking from our own work at Public Works Partners. And then finally, section 4, we will have questions and answers. Hopefully you will have lots of questions by then, and we'll be able to have a great dialogue. I do understand that webinars don't provide the best opportunity for dialogue, but being a specialist in community engagement and facilitation myself, I try to make them as interactive as possible. So let's get to it. What exactly is placemaking? We're going to start with a few definitions to understand what urban placemaking is, what it accomplishes, what's involved in the process of placemaking, and who benefits from it. We'll start off with what is placemaking. To me, as we were preparing for this webinar, I kept making this X with my hands to think about. To me, urban placemaking is the intersection of design and the activation and use of space. So architects and urban designers and landscape architects can design beautiful spaces, but in many ways, for me at least, not being a bit biased, urban planners are the ones who bring the people. Like, we are about activating and using a space and making it an integral part of the community. And that's what placemaking is. It is the process of creating vibrant public places in which people want to live, work, and play, and that continue to evolve and adapt over time. Placemaking works to maximize the value of a space for the community. This is a really important concept because it's not about maximizing the property value of a space or even of the buildings around it, which, as you can imagine, when you live in a dense city like New York City, people think a lot about how to maximize their property values. But this is about maximizing what I would call the community value of a space, the ability and desire of members of the community, both local residents and workers, to use a space and make it part of their world rather than just kind of looking at it from afar or even actively avoiding it. To fully understand placemaking, we're going to start by digging into the history a little bit. The theory of placemaking was born in the early 1960s to bring people-centric design back into urban public spaces. It was a response to the trends in architecture and urban planning that brought us urban renewal and design for the movement of people, goods, and services. Designing for movement and pulling or pushing people and goods through an urban space really created unwelcoming and unfunctional public spaces that were also ultimately unsafe, both from the point of view of traffic, crime, lack of street life, etc. So in 1960, Kevin Lynch published The Image of the City. In The Image of the City, he used case studies of Los Angeles, Boston, and Jersey City, New Jersey, to explore what urban form means to the people who live in that city and what the role of urban planners is in shaping the experience of city dwellers. In 1961, all of this will be on the AICP exam, by the way. In 1961, Jane Jacobs published The Death and Life of Great American Cities, often paired with one of its most famous maxims, which is the eyes on the street, that people keep people safe, right? Jane Jacobs put forth a critique of prevailing urban planning practices, particularly in New York City from the 1950s and 1960s, and a call for a recognition of the complexity of human interactions in cities. I think of this as the people keep people safe, right? But also people create the city that they live in. The built environment and the form is almost the canvas upon which people live their lives and do their work. In 1968, Henri Lefebvre published The Right to the City. It called for the decommodification of urban life through public space interventions that promote collective action. Then in the 1970s and through the early 1980s, William H. White, who was working with the New York City Planning Commission to develop comprehensive plans for New York City, and he received a grant to study the evolution of newly planned public spaces, such as plazas and smaller parks. He turned this into the Street Life Project throughout the 1970s, which was a long-term study of public spaces in the city. And his findings were published in a book called The Social Life of Small Urban Places in 1980. And I think for some people, thinking of small urban places and New York City in the same sentence can seem discordant, but actually any city, New York City among them, is made up of a series of small neighborhoods all strung together into a larger city. Fred Kent in 1975, who was part of the Street Life Project and was heavily influenced by William H. White, then established the Project for Public Spaces in the mid-70s. The Project for Public Spaces still exists, and it's one of our most important sources of resources, both for this presentation, but also for urban placemaking in general. And then moving up to kind of the late 1990s and early 2000s, we saw the rise of the movement called New Urbanism, which was a design movement with roots, in the post-war era that called for designing walkable and livable cities. Wasn't always perfect, still isn't always perfect, because sometimes they sort of create isolated neighborhoods, but with walkable centers. But I think the new urbanism has learned from its mistakes over the years. Um, and I think a lot of the principles of the new urbanism have filtered into the wider urban planning over the field, such as transit-oriented development, regional planning approaches to green space, and other community assets. And then in 2000, Robert Putnam, who's actually a sociologist, not an urban planner, put out a really influential book called Bowling Alone. And he made the argument in that book that social capital and community was really on the decline in the United States ever since the 1970s. He used the example of people used to join bowling leagues, but then by the early 2000s, if they were bowling at all, they were bowling alone. He suggested that mobility and car-based sprawl were among the causes of the decline in social capital. So some of his recommendations, including city designs that, again, created walkable public spaces where there was more interaction between people and art and culture. And that brings us to the present day, well, 20 years later, and begs the question, why is urban placemaking gaining even more traction now? As I mentioned before, placemaking is where design and activation or the community actually intersect. And in practice, this can mean many things. Excuse me. It's not just a design strategy. It's not just a commitment to public engagement. And it's not just how the space is used, but it's really all of these factors coming together to create a place. The adaptability of placemaking strategies and the design interventions that those strategies promote, and the emphasis on the co-creation of solutions make placemaking a great tool for urban planners to have in your toolkit now. These exact attributes also set placemaking apart from other approaches to planning and design. So placemaking places its emphasis on collective visioning and decision making. It focuses on temporary and transitional elements. One common approach or one common way of thinking about this aspect of placemaking is through tactical urbanism. So there's a common approach used in placemaking, and it focuses on using low cost, scalable, and often temporary interventions that can be led by community members. So some examples could be a street fair, a farmer's market, a public art exhibit. And these things in turn create community change because they make spaces that may once have been devoid of interaction and life accessible to a wide and evolving set of community members, including people from different backgrounds and abilities. Urban design elements are also really important. So placemaking isn't just about sticking a farmer's market on a parking lot. It is also about cohesion within and among existing cultural and physical resources to improve the experience of the space, and designing connections to surrounding neighborhoods and buildings, which in turn promotes a sense of place and can build a sense of community ownership. One of my favorite examples that I'll return to in a few times over the course of this conversation is work that we did with the public library system in New Rochelle, New York, which is a small city outside of New York City. And the main library is smack in the middle of downtown New Rochelle in a relatively small building, situated within an increasingly high density neighborhood of apartments and office buildings. And so what the library has set out to do is to really activate the plaza in front of it and the park around it, as well as the public space inside the library, to create a community hub where people coming from a lot of different walks of life are able to interact and benefit from being a part of New Rochelle. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then also, not on this slide, but maintenance and management. As part of this focus on accommodating change, incorporating temporary elements, being adaptable, maintenance and management of the space is a big part of placemaking. It's not just set it and forget it. It's not just put some benches in a space and then you're done. It's really about continually observing and managing the space so that the place remains vibrant. So these differences and these emphases in placemaking translate into benefits for the neighborhood and the community. Effective placemaking can create spaces that are accessible and useful rather than empty. It can allow people and enable them to gather, to socialize, and to celebrate community in the way that they want to. That doesn't look the same for everyone, right? I think one thing we have learned a lot in recent efforts in the last, say, 20 years in New York City is as we have continued to work to try to revitalize and enhance public access to our waterfronts in New York City, people want to be able to fish. Urban planners may not want to be able to fish. And when we think about our very classic, sort of playground audience of families with small children, they might not want to fish, but lots of residents do. And so that's one of the things we've learned in urban planning over the years is that we ask the community what they want out of a space and then enable them and empower them, again, to be in community in the way that they want to be. This in turn leads to healthier communities that can grow and thrive and increase their social capital, that can also provide health benefits. And placemaking also gives planners and designers a framework in which they can test ideas in collaboration with community members. Placemaking interventions tend to be pretty local and relatively small scale. And so in that way, it really does create a nice laboratory for new ideas. In the longer term, this can lead to significant positive outcomes for communities. It enables places to promote connections, be catalyst for positive change and opportunity, be grounds for collective action, and inspire the spontaneous interactions that make city life unique. Again, back to Jane Jacobs and the idea that people create the cities that they want to live in. Placemaking also places a significant emphasis on using public spaces to create value for the community. As we said before, placemaking is that intersection between design and activation or people. It's where the social and human element comes in to use the design and activate a space that in turn creates vibrant communities. Some examples, I mentioned the New Rochelle Public Library. Libraries are crucial community hubs, which if planners work with them using placemaking principles can become even better areas for creating community. Public squares, simple sidewalks, plazas, transit hubs, markets, and it's not always about scale. Sometimes it can occur at a really grand scale. Your largest city railroad station, in New York City, we have Grand Central, we have, large urban parks. But then also at a really small scale, that plaza right in front of the library, the sidewalk in one of your commercial corridors. So far, we've talked about big picture ideas behind placemaking. Now we're gonna just bring it down a notch to talk a little bit about the details. So who does placemaking? I've talked about urban planners, I've talked about designers, but the center of urban placemaking is the community stakeholders, They should be at the center of all placemaking activities. Placemaking works best if community members define the vision, if they articulate their needs, if they validate the designs and alternatives that are being put forth, and then support the systems that are to be implemented. Community members can be a key part of that ongoing management and maintenance strategy as well. Developers, which we use as kind of a term that also includes property owners, municipalities, but also property developers perhaps, they're responsible for pursuing development strategies that can support the creation and management of vibrant public spaces. That entity is often the client in a placemaking project. And then the third leg of that stool is urban planners and urban designers. We are the agents of placemaking. We consider the potential role and value add of a place. We manage the project as it unfolds. We look at the regulatory considerations. We often facilitate that community engagement and those dialogues. We parse out the technical details. We make the plans. We make recommendations and develop designs that incorporate that community vision. And so those are your three legs. And then next, we're going to look at the essential elements of placemaking. We've said this before, but I keep coming back to it. The three key elements of placemaking that are in turn becoming central throughout urban planning and design is community, those impacted by the project. Working with community and defining who the community can be a little tricky. It's those who live, work, or otherwise spend time in the area and who are impacted by the space, right? But sometimes you have spaces where you may have people who live nearby, but you also have a lot of visitors. One of the case studies we're going to talk about, we'll dive into that a little bit. So you have to consider who really is your core community that you're working with. You have to start bringing the community into the process early in your planning. The second essential element is the design, right? Designing a space that has designated areas for activation, that has different elements to it. Thinking about thoughtful strategies for managing how people move through the space, and how activities happen. For example, as part of the design, there may be permanent design features such as lighting, playgrounds, basketball courts. There may also be more temporary design features such as movable furniture or play elements. It's important as part of the design to connect to the design and character of surrounding blocks and neighborhoods. And then finally, activation. Activation is how you use the public space to advance community building and social interaction. And when I say you, I really mean everyone, the urban planners, the developers, and the community, because people choose how they use a space, and it may not work out to be exactly the way the planners thought it was going to be. Activation includes strategies to bring people into the spaces and encourage interaction, which could be, we mentioned farmers markets, food truck pop-ups, concerts, but also could be things like permanent seating or public art elements. These three elements together are urban placemaking. As we wrap up this first section, if you're interested in learning more about placemaking, we have a couple of resources, and we can share some of this information through Christine after the webinar as well. So I mentioned the Project for Public Spaces. They have an excellent website with training, technical assistance, placemaking toolkits, and they also sponsor events and conferences and talks themselves. The National Endowment for the Arts actually has great resources around creative placemaking, centering art, including how to do it, information on their creative placemaking grants programs. They also do technical assistance and toolkits and have other resources. If anyone else has other resources that are their go-to resources, and you wouldn't mind putting them in the question box, we can share those out when we get to the question and answer session. Or maybe I'll actually just take a short pause. Christine, anything come through in terms of questions or comments that it would be helpful to share now?
Not yet.
Okay, great. Everyone's still getting warmed up.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to go into section 2 now. So we've talked about the history of placemaking. We've defined it. Now, the $500,000 question is, how do you do it? What do you do? We're going to walk through the integral tools in your toolkit for placemaking and what makes each of them essential. There's a few important things to understand here. Placemaking is iterative. It's a cycle, and once you do it once, even for the same space, you're going to keep doing it over time. You start with research, and we're going to go through into each of these in a little more detail. But the cycle of placemaking is, first you do research to understand the space and the context of the community around it. Then you engage with key stakeholders and the wider community to understand their needs. Then you make a plan. Then you implement that plan and actually, do your placemaking or your design. And then finally, you manage it. Again, crucial. It's not a set it and forget it. It has to be, this is about actively managed space. And to be honest, this is also how you should be managing just about any urban planning project. And it's really kind of our process at Public Works for doing our work as well, whether it be placemaking or other types of projects too. The first step is research. The role of urban planners and designers as the agents of placemaking is to understand and translate the needs of community members into a physical design and activation. You start that by doing research into the history of the place that you're trying to make, the neighborhood around it, how that community has evolved and shifted over time, and the current context in which you're working. A few questions that you may want to ask in this research phase is, have there been significant new developments recently? Or has there been a history of significant disinvestment in this area? What are the demographics of the community and how are they changing? What is the socioeconomic makeup of the community? What are the assets surrounding this place? Library, commercial corridor, affordable housing, key other assets that you want to make sure that you're connecting to and taking advantage of. Why is this project happening now? What's the impetus? Why is it happening here? These are all questions to ask up front. A few tips on how to answer these questions and conduct this research. Review the history of the site and of the neighborhood. Go beyond just the built environment to learn about cultural elements and elements of the site that hold special meaning for the community, for example. Do observations, do pedestrian counts, observe use patterns in the space. Is it used more by certain subsets of the community than others? How is it being used? Are people using the space in ways it was not originally designed for? I talked about fishing earlier. I used to live in Lower Manhattan near the base of the Brooklyn Bridge. And at that time, access to the water was totally fenced off and walled off. but people had figured out how to get through sections of the fence to get down to the waterfront to fish. And so when planners were able to observe that real life community use of the waterfront, they were able to provide safe and equitable access to the water to enable people to do what they wanted to do. Another example is using an open field as a dog park, cutting across lawns, otherwise known as desire paths. What are you observing when you just watch the space? Are there community groups in charge of the space, either formally or informally? Is there a friends association or just concerned community members or 2 or 3 that have taken on maintenance of a space? Meet with those folks firsthand to learn more about the space and how they think it could be activated more. Once you've done this background research, you're ready to engage the wider community. Developing a robust and transparent community engagement up front provides meaningful opportunities for community members to engage in your placemaking process. There's a few steps that we follow. First, you want to create a community engagement plan. This can be a formal deliverable that's shared with your client and with your community or with your municipality, or it could just be a spreadsheet that helps guide your own work and the work of your team. But what it should entail is it should lay out your goals for the engagement, the strategies you'll use to reach your goals, the timeline that you're working on, and how you will measure the success of your engagement. It's important to understand for this particular project whether you want really wide engagement, you want to try to reach a lot of community members, or whether you want to really dig in and understand the needs and desires of a smaller group, perhaps just from the immediate neighborhood, because that will inform the tactics and strategies that you actually use. You want to confirm the public rationale and the goals for the project overall, because that'll inform how you present your work. And you want to define what those tactics and strategies are going to be and when they're going to happen and when you'll be done with this phase of the project. These aspects of your community engagement plan should be communicated to key stakeholders and community leaders up front. They can help you refine your approach, alert you to risks to your timeline, etc. A quick example of this is we do a lot of work with public housing residents. And at least in New York City, it's very popular and traditional for public housing residents to have festivals in their developments called family days, usually at the end of summer, in August into early September before school starts. And in some ways, those can be great ways to informally get community input on specific issues, but it's also never a good time to have to try to schedule formal community engagement because everyone's very focused on their family day. Now, establish metrics and measures of success. It's important to do this up front and to build some evaluation strategies into your engagement approach. So that you can assess your progress and adjust course if needed. Your engagement plan is going to be really valuable to you as you start the active engagement process. Engagement strategies can vary a lot depending on the needs of your community. As an engagement expert myself, I have a few tips. One is create multiple opportunities and avenues for engagement. I think in the course of the pandemic, we have all learned to make online engagement like webinars work a lot better than they used to. But we've also learned that they are actually really valuable tools to enable folks who may not be able to come in person because of childcare needs or accessibility needs. They may be able to join a virtual engagement because that's actually easier for them to do from the comfort of their own home. But you also want to have in person because, again, a lot of folks are more comfortable engaging more in person. or by phone or on paper, for example. Meet people where they are. Use the space that is the focus of your project. Are you working on how to activate a particular plaza? Do engagement activities in that plaza. It's like a naturally occurring, user experience design or charrette location. Partner with community-based organizations. Do tabling, do little pop-ups at things that are already happening. I particularly love taking advantage of existing events and activities to try to get people's input. Use local assets, make phone calls. You have people who like to come in person, you have people who like to do stuff online. You definitely still have a good population who doesn't really want to do either of those things, and phone calls can be the best way to reach them. If you're having meetings, whether in person or online, try scheduling them at a few different times of day to get different audiences. And then finally, make it interactive. Use games, use interactive renderings or maps. Come on, we're planners, and people love to use maps. Group activities to get people involved. Have fun with it. If folks have a few of their own favorite engagement strategies for public spaces, please feel free to put them in the question boxes, and we'll share some of them back out during the Q&A. Once you've done all these engagement activities, it's really important to analyze your findings and use the findings to develop clear community supported insights. If people have given their time and their thoughts to you, it's really important, and part of your obligation, your ethical obligation as an urban planner, to use those insights to inform the work that you're doing. It's also the best way to build and maintain credibility with your community. With those insights, it's time to then make your plan. Bring your research, your engagement, and your vision together to make the plan for what you're actually going to do. That plan is an opportunity to strengthen public support for your project. Present your vision. Explain how and why decisions were made, specifically talking about feedback you received, and invite further feedback and workshopping. Your plan is also an opportunity to build transparency and accountability into your project. Establish how and when changes will be made. Think about how they're going to impact use of the space. Include what, if any, disruptions may be caused by the implementation of this placemaking. Is there going to be construction? Are sections of a space going to be closed off at some point? Who's responsible for different aspects of the implementation? And what are some of the obstacles or dependencies? For example, there needs to be some fundraising done, or there are boards that need to approve a process. Once your research is done, your engagement has gotten to a good place, and you've got your plan, it's time to put it into action. This will look different in each space and place. Remember that placemaking is design and activation. Remember this as you implement. Here are a few tips for how to put your plan into action. First, activate the space. Implement your vision for the space or the project. Often it's great to focus on high impact but short-term interventions first. That could involve painting the street, painting spaces, set up flexible seating areas, create new green spaces, whatever is called for in your plan. Work with the community to put your plan into action. Keep building community connections. You could do things like organize planting days, organize painting activities, or just fun activities to keep the community involved as you build out your design and your space. Excuse me. You want to also establish responsibility for evaluating and measuring the impact of your space. You want to communicate, establish clear, accessible lines of communication so that community members can provide feedback as you put the plan into place. For example, if there's excessive noise during construction, people should have a way to alert you to that. If there's access issues that are created, and you want to communicate out about progress and any potential delays. I've often found that business improvement districts and public plaza managers are really the masters at putting placemaking plans into place and activating their spaces. If anyone from that type of organization is in the webinar, please drop a line in the question box about an action that you love, and we'll share some of those back out. The last part of the process, but definitely not the least part, because ultimately it takes the longest because it keeps going, is managing the space. Management is a core component of placemaking. Robust management strategies will help you continuously improve the space, keep it activated, and help to ensure that the site is maintained and meeting its potential. Often as urban planners and urban designers, we think about the design and the plan, and then we may hand it off to the owner of the space or the manager of the space, and we don't necessarily think about what happens after that. But placemaking is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop. That's why it's an ing word. You don't just make a place once. Managing your placemaking plan. Assign roles and discuss funding strategies up front. And by up front, I mean before you've even fully implemented the design. Develop evaluation strategies that will work for those who ultimately use them. For example, use commonly used tools to track metrics. Make sure that managers of the space have the training and the resources they need to use the evaluation tools effectively. Plan for change and create a system that facilitates adaptation. For example, a yearly request for art installation proposals so that every year you may have new art being displayed in your space. A simple online form, a Google form for reporting lost or broken park furniture. By the way, also an ongoing budget to replace that lost or broken furniture, because it does that. It will need to be continually kind of updated and refreshed. Over time, your management process will continue to provide insights that will support your next placemaking cycle. So we've talked about all of this up to now in in kind of more academic and abstract terms. But now I want to talk about two case studies in our third section of work that we have done around placemaking. I'm going to walk you through these two case studies in which public works partners played a key role in placemaking, but they were also part of much larger efforts as well. Which is often how we work as planners, right? First up, we have a project with the Friends of the High Line. The Friends of the High Line is the nonprofit manager of the High Line, a renowned adaptive reuse project in New York City. The High Line took infrastructure that had once been considered obsolete and transformed it into an active public area and a park. This is, in many ways, kind of the ultimate example of placemaking. They took an obsolete elevated freight railway that ran down the west side of Manhattan and transformed it into a public park and a place for gathering, for celebration, for nature, and for major public art installations. Public Works Partners doesn't get to take any credit for that original act of placemaking. But before we get into that, we have a quick poll. Have you visited the High Line before? I think Christine is going to
Yep,
share that
I am
poll.
right now. And okay, so I just launched it and I'm looking all through frantically through my records because I know we've had a webcast about the Highline. And so I'm trying to find it so that I can put it in the chat box, the link to it, if you're interested in the webcast that we had about it. So I will find it and I will be sure to put it in there.
That's great. If you are not, if you're on the call and you haven't visited the Highline or you're not really familiar with it, I would absolutely recommend listening into some of that webcast, even just checking out the website. And in fact, the Highline has actually now been part of a collaborative to create a network called the Highline Network of similar adaptive reuse public spaces around the country. I believe there's one that they're working on called the Low Line in Miami. There is the Atlanta Beltline in Atlanta, and I think there are others. So if you know of one in your community, I'd love to hear about that as well.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and close these results and then share them. So 35% of those on the line have visited the Highline before. Wow, that's really impressive. I am surprised. And then 64% said no, 1% not sure. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those results.
Thank you so much for everyone for answering, and Christine.
I do have the second question. Do you want to go ahead and do the second one?
Yeah,
okay.
That'd be great. Thank you. So what makes the Highline a successful example of placemaking? And you have 5 options and you can pick as many of them as you want.
We'll give it a few more seconds here.
Yep. I'm not exactly sure how I would answer this question.
And I just found the webcast, and it also discusses the Atlanta Beltline as well within the same webcast. So I'm gonna put the link directly to our YouTube to that session recording here in the chat box in a moment, as soon as we finish up this poll here. Give it another second. Okay. Well, I should say, I think I would have definitely probably gone with all of the above myself, which I think is clearly here with 63% is our majority. But then also, the folks were putting in, any of the above they could choose. So all of them clearly are successful examples. Or what makes the Highline successful.
There was a little bit of trending of people going more towards adaptive reuse and green space, and a little less towards flexibility and a neighborhood landmark. And that's actually interesting because it leads into actually what we did with the Highline a little bit. So thank you. Because what has happened with the Highline in the now about between 10 and 15 years since it fully opened is the Highline has become one of the top tourist destinations in New York City. Hence why, if you visited New York City in the last decade, you probably checked out the Highline. But what it has not actually become is a neighborhood resource or a neighborhood landmark. When the pandemic, I think that prior to the pandemic, Friends of the Highline certainly knew that their primary audience and visitors were tourists, just anecdotally. But when the pandemic hit, in order to preserve social distancing on the Highline, Friends of the Highline instituted a timed entry system. Because while the Highline is a public park, because it's elevated, there are only certain places where you can go up or down. So they're able to manage the flow of people in and out of it in a way that you can't at a large open access park. And so by having people do timed entry, they were able to see with much greater detail who it was who was visiting the High Line. And while you would think tourism dropped precipitously, but still there's evidence that the vast majority of visitors to the High Line are tourists, and very few local residents actually visit the High Line. The neighborhood around the High Line is largely Chelsea. Along the High Line, there has been there has been an intense amount of new development. Major buildings by international architects have been built to maximize the views and the kind of beauty of the High Line. Yet at the same time, Chelsea is home to both significant amounts of public housing, affordable, like subsidized affordable housing of different types, as well as naturally occurring affordable housing and senior housing. So the High Line knew that there was a vibrant and really varied neighborhood literally at its doorsteps that was not fully engaging with the High Line or making use of this space. So they decided to do something about it. So Friends of the High Line engaged Public Works partners to recommend, I'm sorry, I'm skipping around. Ava, just stay on this slide for a second, okay? Public Works was engaged to recommend operational strategies that would enable the High Line to better connect and knit itself into its community and serve more as a resource to the local community, while also ensuring kind of sustainability and success for the High Line. Now we'll go to approach to the next slide. Public Works Partners' approach to this effort was first and foremost to engage the community to understand why didn't they go to the High Line? How did they view the High Line? What did they need from it? And where did they see gaps and needs in their neighborhood, either in their own lives or in their neighbors' lives? We defined the community that the High Line wished to engage as kind of the kind of naturally bound area considered to be Chelsea within, say, 3 or 4 blocks of the High Line in either direction, the full length of the park itself. We developed an engagement strategy that we implemented immediately, but also gave a long-term engagement strategy to the High Line to be able to continually work with its community. And through that, ultimately, we developed a set of recommendations that are grounded in placemaking principles. And I want to walk you through that process and the impact. As part of our work together, we did a survey where we surveyed over 1,000 residents of Manhattan's West Side at community events. You saw the picture on the last slide. We were at senior center Zumba classes. We were at soup kitchens. We were at art-based events, restaurants, outdoor dining. We distributed our survey through community-based organizations. There are several very active social service organizations that serve the needs of that community. And they helped us get the word out about the survey and also hosted us to speak to groups. They also shared information through social media. The High Line itself also has its own board, but it also has a neighborhood advisory council and a youth council. We leveraged all of those groups to understand and do initial research, as well as use their networks to get the survey out and collect information from people. In addition to local residents, we also did a survey for businesses that are near the High Line. Again, there are a lot of local businesses that serve the residents, whether that be, small scale restaurants, local grocery stores, other types of businesses that are grounded in the community. We wanted to understand what their needs were and how a relationship with the High Line could help them. This enabled us to build our understanding of the relationship between the High Line itself, the community around it, and the institutions that really serve that community. One of the questions that we were very interested in is, for example, could the High Line provide vending opportunities for local small businesses and restaurants? They have food carts and things like that at certain parts of the High Line. Or could they just do wayfinding and signage to connect the people who visit the High Line to the community below it, which could help both local residents, local businesses, and tourists, right? To knit the up level of the High Line with the street level below it. The feedback gathered informed how the High Line can best support the needs of local residents and gives an internal perspective on the High Line's role in the community. And so we developed an approach to position the High Line as a community anchor institution, as an institution that can support employment needs, social service needs, and other community needs by partnering with both businesses and community-based organizations to use its resources, the High Line's resources, both the physical asset of the High Line itself, as well as their programming, their ability to provide employment, and other aspects of who the High Line is and what they do to support their community. The recommendations are really focused on creating a space that's not just a physical part of the community, but also is an active player within the community. So that's the end of the High Line case study. Now we're going to talk about work that we have done within the city of Syracuse, New York. This is recent work with a neighborhood in the city of Syracuse called the Southwest Gateway, which is adjacent to the downtown central business district in Syracuse. This is a picture of the city of Syracuse, which is, again, in upstate New York. This project was called the Southwest Gateway Downtown Revitalization Initiative Strategic Investment Process. Before I get into what that mouthful of a title means, we do have another quick poll. Now, are you familiar with the New York State Downtown Revitalization Initiative, which you're probably only familiar with that if you are a New Yorker or you do work in New York State?
We'll give it another second here.
Yep.
Okay.
No, mostly no, not surprising. Well, you may have a similar set of initiatives through the economic development arm of your own state or municipality. It's an economic development program overseen by the state of New York that has created a competitive funding opportunities for local municipalities to access grants and resources to support downtown area revitalization. The goals of the funding overall are to create vibrant, walkable downtowns that create economic opportunity, promote sustainable transportation, and spur growth. The Syracuse project was designed to counteract some of the lasting impacts of urban renewal and population decline in this kind of traditional post-industrial city. This particular project was an explicit effort to reconnect this neighborhood called the Southwest Gateway with the downtown central business district and to engage communities in this process. During the planning process, immediate outcome was to select a set of projects, infrastructure projects, that would then share in a pot of $10 million for capital improvements to to improve this part of the city. So to do this, we took an approach that was really grounded in a placemaking strategy. First, we facilitated a steering committee of neighborhood stakeholders, including local residents, leaders of community organizations, and elected officials and business owners. We facilitated charrettes and kind of human-centered design exercises with an explicit focus on placemaking elements such as identifying where interventions like trees and streetlights made the most sense for that community. We worked with the rest of the consultant team, the state, and the city of Syracuse to develop recommendations to lead to their desired outcomes. Some of the projects under consideration included streetscape improvements, creating more pedestrian-friendly streets, making buildings more visually appealing, especially activating some underutilized and abandoned properties, and then connecting this Southwest Gateway to the Central Business District by activating an underpass under a railroad bridge. The final recommendations accomplished a lot of those goals and are focused around a series of efforts to redevelop underutilized properties, make the streets more pedestrian friendly, especially through trees and lighting and more of a sense of safety, and to support some outdoor vendor spaces to bring activation to the streets. So that's that one's a little quicker, but a different case study. And as we finish up, I just wanted to summarize a couple things. So as a reminder, placemaking is the intersection of urban design and activation for people. You can approach this from multiple perspectives, including community engagement, economic policy, urban design, and when done thoughtfully, urban placemaking is an effective framework to bring community, design, and activation together to create vital and active public spaces. And so with that, thank you so much for listening. I think we're still at over 250 people out of the original 258 who joined, so I appreciate it. And I'm hoping Christine has a couple questions that we can talk about. My contact information and our social media information is all on that slide. But I think while we chat, maybe we will we'll stop sharing the slides and just
Perfect.
Chat a little bit.
Wonderful. Great. So again, folks, if you have questions, just type them in your questions box. So this first one, you've talked a lot about stakeholders and making sure that the right people are at the table to start this process. So how do you know when you've thoroughly accounted for an ample cross-section of stakeholders, and what goes into the thought process of compiling an initial stakeholder list?
That is an excellent question. I can say, and this will sound familiar to all of us, it almost always involves a spreadsheet, right? You start with just making a list of everyone, the initial people who are kind of sponsoring the project. You just ask them, everyone who should be the stakeholders. And then you go ask those stakeholders who should be the stakeholders. And then maybe you do that third level of asking those stakeholders who should be the stakeholders. And what I find is in just about any community, you get to a point of circularity, right? Where people are telling you the same people, like 5 different people mention this one person, you definitely know that person or that organization should be a part of the conversation. And I think that's typically, there is a research term for that I can't think of right now, where you kind of just ask people until you get the same names over and over again. But that is typically the way that we do it. And then also a little bit of shoe leather, right? Like literally walking the area to figure out what are the institutions that are represented, what are the businesses, and think a little bit creatively about, because often institutional stakeholders will tell you other institutional stakeholders, right? They may not think about the guy who runs the deli on the corner who sees everything that happens in that plaza and could be a really important person to engage with. So you want to try to think a little outside the box as well.
Great. Next one. So, what happens when your placemaking exercise fails to achieve its intended goal? So then what are the strategies for revisiting this down the road?
That's a good one as well. I think that if your placemaking strategy fails to achieve its stated goal, that just means step one has failed to achieve your stated goal, and you just move on to step two, right? If if what you thought was going to work hasn't worked, you go back to your stakeholders and you ask them, why do you think it's not working and what might work better? And you do perhaps also another round of research and observation. Are people interacting with the space, but perhaps they're just not doing what you thought they would do? And maybe there are ways that you could actually meet their needs better by shifting your activation a little bit. An example is if you put up chess tables and thinking that you'd have senior citizens who would come play chess, but actually you've got kids who are using the space to do homework on their laptops and access the free laptop Wi-Fi, maybe you need to cater more to kids.
It's called the snowball method or snowball sampling. Everyone, the people know.
Thank you. I'm writing that down so I don't forget again next time.
It makes sense. I get it.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. I'm going to break this up into a couple questions, actually. So the first part is, how do you convince those with the decision-making powers that a community-centered placemaking approach is the right move for a specific project? And what kinds of constraints are the biggest barriers to implementing such an approach? And I should think that those are the first, whatever those constraints are, the biggest barriers are the things that you want to demystify first to your decision-making powers. So how do we convince them? What do we do? How do we make sure, that we get them comfortable with the concept of real true placemaking for a particular project?
This one can be really hard. The case studies that I gave, frankly, were clients or decision-making authorities, sponsors who already wanted to do that and came to us with that idea. But if you are in especially a government or institutional context where perhaps there may be mandated community engagement, which is not one of my least favorite terms, right? But it's hard to make it actually successful. I think that sometimes, so one approach is to show sponsors examples where this process has worked well. And, so show them what success looks like, because that can make people much more open and less afraid of trying it. Another approach can be to marshal that research and to show them what the community is like and do those observations so that you have some evidence to show, for example, that this space is underutilized, but that there are needs in the community around it, and you could use this space to meet those needs. Sometimes elected officials can actually be really good allies in this effort because it's their job to listen to and respond to their constituents. So sometimes elected officials can get excited about work like this and become real champions for it. I'll stop there, but if other people have ideas. throw them in because I'd love to hear them too.
So I guess that's one side is the political powers, the folks that say yay or nay and, hand over the money needed to do this. Well, what happens if the community has apathy over a placemaking project and you can't get them to engage?
Yeah, another good aspect of this. I think that's where we turn most to trusted messengers, to community-based organizations that already have a stake in this community and whom community members already trust and interact with. And if you can help those organizations or stakeholders understand how this project could benefit the community members that they care about and are their constituents, then they can become champions for this work and can help draw people out and pull them out. And even, host events.
Okay. Next question. When we're talking about placemaking, and do places have to be outdoors? Is that sort of the first rule of thumb, is that it needs to be a space that is public, available to all, and outdoor? And then in the process of placemaking, I guess, how do we talk about maintaining and cleaning these spaces? And
Right.
then let's stop there, and then I'll
Okay.
go on, because there's a bunch of questions on this.
So I mean, I think the very first question is no, they absolutely do not have to be outdoors. They do have to be publicly accessible. You can do placemaking work on, for example, a college campus, which it's a little questionable if that's really fully publicly accessible, right? But that's not necessarily the same type of, that's not exactly what I'm talking about when I'm talking about urban placemaking, because the work that, the work we're describing is inherently public work, but it does not have to be outdoor work, right? Especially in colder climates. You have a lot of indoor public spaces that are crucial parts of the community, whether that be inside your library, inside your train station, post offices, malls. Questionable again whether that's truly public space and public access, but yeah, I think it behooves all of us to look creatively at where there is public access that can be accessible and in an equitable way, but also, frankly, climate friendly for the residents of your area. I mentioned living in cold climates because that's where I live, but living in really hot climates is, you have some similar issues in terms of people tending to be inside in the hotter months.
That was part of the next question, was those of us that live in climates either that see a lot of rain, a lot of snow, or a lot of heat. So can you dive just a little bit deeper into public indoor spaces? I know you just gave some examples that may or may not count, but do you have some like surefire examples of indoor placemaking spaces?
Yeah, I think transportation hubs, right? Even if you don't have a train station, you may have a bus station or some other intermodal transit hub, which inherently, I mean, if it's public transit, it must be publicly accessible space. And those are spaces that can be activated in some really interesting ways, and can create a community. You can create a community scene that can double it can help activate a space that might be rather empty, provide resources to the community, and like double as something that might draw people into your public transportation system, which is another exciting one. This, I hadn't really thought about this, which is interesting because we're doing a lot of bus system redesign work right now. But like, could we think about small bus shelters, right? Like, I'm not talking about necessarily just a place where you just have a sign hanging on the light pole, which is the saddest kind of bus stop, but like, if you have a small shelter at a bus stop, can you activate that? You know, could you have a public art installation, right? Well, that seems a simple one, right? But could you have a little free library there, or a free pantry where people could access some resources?
In your example of the High Line, you spoke first that it turned out very quickly that the High Line was for those not living in the community, that it was an attraction. And I guess to that then, how do we prevent something like that from happening to begin with? Or I guess from a larger perspective, what do we do to deter the gentrifying effects of placemaking that sometimes happens?
Yeah, that is a huge question. Um, and to be honest, it's fraught in a few different ways. Like, this is a whole nother session, right? Where I would want to get some gentrification experts in. But I think something that I have heard recently in this conversation is, yes, you want to prevent gentrification, but you also want to assume that everyone in the community deserves a nice place, right? Like, you can't not do placemaking for fear of gentrification. You just have to think about how to mitigate those effects. And I know that Washington, D.C. is actually working very hard to create a linear park, um, that is explicitly trying to avoid gentrification effects. And if anyone knows the park I'm talking about, if you could put it in the question box, I would love um, to. It is. I'm looking it up and I'm trying to remember. Anyway, so I think people are beginning to pay attention to this, right? After kind of seeing the lesson, learning some of the cautionary lessons of the High Line. There's not.
11th Street Bridge Park.
Thank you. I love this group, 11th Street Bridge Park. I'm going to look that up. I encourage folks, because they're tackling this question very actively, and trying to understand how to do this right. Again, because everybody deserves nice public spaces, but how do we do that without, then filling their borders with Starkitect buildings? And, not for nothing, and the Highline folks say this, right? But like, there was some level on the city of New York's part of explicitly using the High Line for property redevelopment. And so I think that's a key place to start, right? Like, don't necessarily redevelop the properties right around your public space. Keep them for the community that's already there.
So there's a couple questions regarding maintenance of places, whether you're trying to maintain the place in the summer or the winter when it's snowing. What is the best method to ensure long-term maintenance? Should we be trying to build this into in a community budget? Should it be, do nonprofits have more success, or community groups, or is it kind of all over the board? But I guess if you have any tips regarding maintenance long-term of these, places.
This isn't the most satisfying answer, but I think there's a real mix, and it depends on the community context. If there is if there is an institution near it, certainly when business improvement districts or active management associations do placemaking, they typically build it into their own role, right, to do that long-term maintenance and management. In New York City, the city jointly, actually with the Horticultural Society of New York City, jointly created a project called the Neighborhood Plaza Project, which is something you could look at, where they provide funds to do capital redevelopment of small plazas around the city, especially in places with that are really lacking in green space. And then they give maintenance grants to local organizations that might be a merchants association, it might be a nonprofit. They kind of try to help foster and foster that local ownership of the spaces.
Let's talk about safety. At what point in the placemaking process do we start talking about that, ensuring that security and safety of our community members are, being taken into account when we're doing this placemaking, whether it be no dark corners and making sure things are properly lighted and that we're taking into account ADA accessibility, things like that. When does this come into play?
I think safety needs to come into play from the very beginning, and your community will bring that up. Community members care a lot about the safety of where they live, and they know and they pay attention. When you do observations, you'll see, right? Pedestrians kind of naturally tend to stick to better lighted pathways and streets rather than darker ones. And people don't use spaces that they perceive as being unsafe. And so safety should be built in from the very beginning. And then fears of crime and perceptions about public safety will absolutely be questions that are brought up from project sponsors, from elected officials, from community members. And for that, I think it comes down to, again, this idea that of the eyes on the street. If you have more people using a space, it actually helps keep that space safer in the long run. In terms of like falls and like weather related and accessibility related safety, I think that's where your urban designers are incredibly important to make sure that materials used don't get slick when it rains or snows on them, right? And that furniture used, even if it breaks, won't provide serious safety hazards. So you have to build safety into, I think, each step of the
process. Real quick before we leave, because we already need to wrap up. I read this article a couple days ago and I loved it. And it was just a bunch of images of desire paths, and particularly on like college campuses, how, either they did like aerial drone footage to find all the desire paths and then made them actual paths, or they just completely took all the concrete out and waited like 2 months just to see where the paths just sort of emerged, and then kind of started the placemaking process off of that. I just found it really interesting. So if you just Google like desire path, like photo montage, you'll get just these, whole lists of them. And it's just really cool to see just, how people think the same when it comes to that kind of thing. And all these trends just sort of emerge. So anyway.
Yeah, I agree. I think desire paths is one of those little gems of urban planning that is so fun. So.
Right, exactly. We need to wrap up. It is 2:30. We've got to go. So thank you to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for hosting today. Don't forget to log your CM credits. You have 1.5 credits. And thank you, of course, to Celeste and your team for joining us today and talking all about placemaking and all the great things that come out of it. So we appreciate you, and of course all of you on the line. Thank you. Don't forget, we're recording this. I'll have it up on our YouTube channel, and be sure to register for our upcoming sessions, including law. So everyone, have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye-bye.